Rebonjour à celles et ceux qui ont été là ce matin et bonjour à ceux qui nous rejoignent maintenant. On est ravis de vous accueillir pour cette deuxième partie de la journée d'études autour des conservations divergentes. Cette fois-ci avec une table ronde qui est dédiée à la question au-delà de l'objectification vers des pratiques vivantes. Table ronde que j'ai l'honneur de partager avec trois intervenantes que je vais présenter tout de suite pour discuter un peu, vous donner un tout petit peu un cadre autour de pratiques de conservation qui prennent en compte l'agentivité des processus matériaux eux-mêmes et les traces que ces processus ont laissées dans les collections. On va essayer de ne pas seulement interroger les vestiges de ces procédés historiques dans les collections et sur les objets, mais aussi de mettre la focale sur des approches qui prioritize, comment on dit ça en français, qui donnent la priorité à la transmission et l'activation de pratiques culturelles vivantes dans des contextes différents. Et pour ça, nos trois intervenantes viennent nous rejoindre de contextes et de backgrounds assez différents en tant que responsables dans un musée, en tant que chercheuse et restauratrice qui travaille avec les collections et sur les collections, et en tant que théoricienne et praticienne des médias et chercheuse artistique dans des villes connectées et éloignées comme Kigali, Paris et Bâle. Chantal Umuhoza à ma droite. Alors là, pour le coup, je vais changer de langue. Je l'annonce aux traductrices. Merci beaucoup d'ailleurs pour vos fantastiques travaux qui nous accompagnent dans cette journée. Is a museum curator at the Rwanda Cultural Heritage Academy. She's in charge of collections management and exhibitions development and interested in projects dealing with biodiversity and conservation, decolonization of conservation practices, museum inclusion, and museum as spaces of well-being, resonating with debates that we had this morning on the first roundtable. She's currently leading a project of digitization of Rwandan heritage. I hope we will speak about that. Flavia Caviezel arrives from Zurich and has a background in ethnography, film studies, and documentary essayistic video practice. She's researching, teaching, and publishing on border issues, ecologies, new materialism, methods and presentation formats, transdisciplinary collaborations at the intersection of artistic scientific practice are characteristic for her work, which is presented internationally in exhibitions and conferences and published lately, for example, by De Gruyter as her current research, Toxic Leftovers of Collections. And I hope that we will speak about that later too. And last but not least, je rechange de langue. En fait, je reste dans la langue dans laquelle les intervenantes vont parler. Ariane Theveniaud est formée en art et archéologie et travaille actuellement sur une thèse au sein du Centre d'histoire culturelle des sociétés contemporaines de l'université Versailles Saint-Quentin-En-Yvelines avec le soutien de la Fondation des sciences du patrimoine. Elle étudie dans cette thèse l'histoire des interventions de conservation-restauration effectuées sur les instruments non occidentaux acquis en période coloniale et conservés au musée de la musique et au musée du Quai Branly. Merci d'être avec nous. Vous voyez déjà un peu dans le profil et les recherches des trois personnes réunies qu'on va avoir des perspectives différentes sur cette question des living transmissions, des transmissions vivantes. Et j'aimerais bien en fait partir d'une question sur les obstacles, sur les difficultés, sur les problèmes que vous identifiez dans votre champ actuel dans les pratiques de conservation. Alors du coup, que vous décriviez quel est en fait le point de départ qui fait qu'un questionnement critique sur les pratiques de conservation s'impose à vous et quelles sont les questions que ça suscite. Peut-être on peut commencer par Chantal.
Vous m'entendez? Okay, I'm going to use English because I'm comfortable in English than French. For me, the challenges that I'm facing day by day, maybe I can start with a little background of my museum. The museum was opened in 1989, and it was a gift of King Baudouin from Belgium. The collections were collected from 50s and 70s, 80s, and the museum opened in 1989. Mostly the collections were collected by Belgian researchers, but at the end of 70s, there were some Rwandans, that were hoping to collect the objects. But in that sense, the objects that were collected, if I may say, were taken out of their context, because they collected the objects, material objects, but they didn't collect somehow intangible part of the objects, because Fatima from Africa, we know that in African communities or in Rwandan society, the intangible and tangible are intertwined, they are connected. Actually, the intangible part is the one that gives the meaning to the tangible part. And in intangible part of the objects that were collected, it's where we find like traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge of conserving objects. If I may give some examples, there were some expressions, there were some traditions that were always accompanying an object. For example, we have like the Batachan in Bahat. It's a sort of calabash. And with the intangible part, there was some expression meaning that where you tie a calabash, you don't throw a stone, meaning that you had to take care of the object. A part of the traditions, there were some other ways when the object were somehow contaminated or somehow damaged, were used to treat the object, but that part was not considered when the objects were collected. That's one of the challenges, but I may also focus that even though right now we are in charge of taking care of our objects, there are no schools in Rwanda that teach how to take care of the object using traditional knowledge. So maybe those are two challenges I may mention. One, that the objects were taken out of their context, and another one, even though we are aware that we might change something, there are no schools that show how we can take care or how we can correct what happened.
Flavia, your starting point was very different when you engaged the work with a specific museum collection that you worked with.
Yes, I'm not really collaborating into a collection or museum, but I had the chance to follow a cleaning process of vintage cars of a collection in Switzerland, which was built in with asbestos. So the toxic part was like a boiler of a vintage car, and it was just discovered by incidents because this foundation was asked to show these vintage cars for an exhibition. And I mean, it's probably also just an ordinary case that it will be discovered by occasion normally, or because there are needs to clean, to use the objects otherwise. So that was in a way the starting point, that I could follow these cleaning processes, and I worked together for one special intense day in a really, how do you call it, the whole garniture you need to go into this kind of cleaning tents, they call it, and for me it was quite intensive and interesting to see how these cleaning processes are going on and what challenges the people are facing, doing in a way the cleaning, and otherwise also the foundation itself, because in this case they were very open with these processes and made it afterwards also public on the website how these cleaning processes went on. But in talking to people, not only on the foundation but also other institutions, it was quite obvious that these collections or persons really in charge of the collections are really confronted with kind of revaluation or elimination, kind of renovation processes until disposal. So I think that's probably the most crucial parts people in collections are confronted with. And from my point of view, I also would say the situation of relationality of toxins, because that was my special focus. Toxins are relational towards something else, towards the environment, towards other persons. And so this kind of agency coming from the object, from the materiality as well, is probably giving a different kind of focus that we could give on this constellation of human and non-human environment working together in kind of different actors that are taking part in this situation.
I hope that we will discuss this a little bit later on. For now, Ariane, I hand over to you. And this, the specific questions that collection of music instruments raises.
Oui, alors du coup, moi, je switch en français. Désolée. Pas de souci. Et oui, enfin, je pense que moi, je vais rejoindre aussi ce qu'exprimait Chantal tout à l'heure. C'est que nous, on fait face à je pense que le véritable défi, c'est de se retrouver responsable de la conservation d'instruments de musique pour lesquels on a très peu de documentation et très peu de connaissances. Et en fait, je pense que pour comprendre tous ces défis, il faut aussi remonter aux raisons qui ont motivé l'acquisition de ces instruments de musique. Alors là, je vais parler un peu plus précisément de lutte, parce que c'est les instruments sur lesquels je travaille, mais en fait, en étudiant la documentation de la fin du 19e et du début du 20e et les catalogues qui ont été écrits par les conservateurs, on se rend compte que une des raisons pour laquelle on va acquérir ces instruments, c'est parce qu'on considère que étudier les instruments de musique non européens permet en réalité d'étudier l'histoire de la musique européenne et des instruments européens. Et en fait, on va chercher à écrire une histoire du développement des instruments de musique dans une approche qui est évidemment évolutionniste. Et on va classer ces instruments de cette manière-là, et ce classement va avoir un impact sur la manière dont on les a conservés ensuite. Et en fait, en étudiant un corpus de lutte provenant d'Afrique de l'Ouest, on s'est rendu compte que parce qu'ils étaient tous classés dans cette même catégorie, on les avait restaurés tous de la même manière, alors même qu'on se rend compte aujourd'hui qu'ils étaient en fait porteurs de spécificités techniques qui ont été effacées par ces interventions de restauration et donc, dont on n'a plus connaissance aujourd'hui. Et donc je pense qu'un des grands défis pour nous maintenant, c'est d'essayer de prendre du recul, de sortir de cette classification et peut-être de se reconcentrer sur l'objet, je dirais, individuellement. Voilà, ce qui n'est pas simple, mais ce qui est important, je pense.
Je vais rebondir directement là-dessus. Ce que tu évoques d'une certaine manière, ce sont les traces que l'histoire de la conservation a laissées sur les objets et qui font que le statut, mais aussi la forme matérielle même sous lesquelles vous les trouvez aujourd'hui n'est pas la même. Les objets ont été de fait transformés. De la question qu'on a posée ce matin de leur reconnexion à un contexte autre que muséal ou pré-muséal comporte cette trace de l'histoire de la conservation. Peut-être tu peux décrire un peu plus en détail cet impact, ou cette histoire et sa matérialisation et les questions que ça pose.
Oui, bien sûr. Alors, effectivement, donc, ces instruments de musique qui ont intégré les collections dès la fin du 19e siècle ont à la fois leur histoire propre qui est antérieure à leur arrivée au sein du musée et à la fois l'impact de leur vie muséale se lie matériellement sur ces instruments. Et alors si je prends l'exemple peut-être plus précis des collections du musée instrumental du Conservatoire de Paris, donc il y a eu une grande période d'acquisition à la fin du 19e, au début du 20e, et ce sont des instruments qui ont ensuite connu une période d'abandon assez longue, où ils ont été très peu valorisés, quasiment pas exposés, et où ils ont été conservés dans des conditions qui étaient assez peu adéquates. Et en fait, ce qui s'est passé, c'est qu'à la fin du XXe siècle, au début des années 90, lorsque les équipes qui étaient en charge de créer le musée de la musique à partir de ces collections ont récupéré donc, ces instruments non européens, ils les ont récupérés dans un état de dégradation qui était extrêmement avancé. Et donc je pense que déjà ça a été un premier choc, et un choc vraiment violent de se rendre compte de l'état dans lequel se trouvaient ces instruments suite à leur passage au sein du musée. Et donc il y a eu une première phase vraiment de sauvegarde en fait de cette collection, avec effectivement, alors on parlait tout à l'heure de la différence entre conservation préventive, conservation curative, restauration. Là, l'idée, c'était vraiment de préserver matériellement cette collection et de la sauver d'un risque de perte totale. Donc, ça a été la première étape, je pense. Et je pense que en fait, c'était aussi l'idée de leur donner une place au sein du musée et de leur redonner une visibilité. Et je pense que ce constat-là a aussi entraîné une grande prudence de la part des intervenants de cette période sur l'idée de ne pas trop intervenir sur ces collections et de pas en rajouter en quelque sorte, de ne pas risquer de les dégrader davantage en intervenant et en commettant des erreurs au moment de l'intervention. Donc je pense qu'il faut vraiment comprendre cette histoire pour comprendre l'état de la collection aujourd'hui et pour se questionner sur, une fois qu'on a fait ce constat-là, qu'est-ce qu'aujourd'hui, comment on peut essayer d'aller plus loin, de valoriser cette collection différemment aujourd'hui. Voilà.
Chantal, tu as l'air de réagir tout de suite. Sinon, je relance. Ça arrive d'être en interaction avec les collections des musées nationaux du Rwanda, et où tu te rends compte que l'histoire de la collection, mais aussi de l'histoire de sa conservation, vous heurter à certaines problématiques qui résultent de cette histoire dans leur activation actuelle.
If I may say, that's okay. If I may say, in 2020, we started decolonizing one of the museums, the one I mentioned, and we also, at the same time, started a project of decolonizing conservation practices, because until then we were still using chemicals to treat the objects. When I joined the museum in 2012, there was a guide du laborantin where it was written, when you treat this object like a metallic object, you have to apply this kind of chemical, you have to mix with this. But at some point, you end up not finding the chemical on the local market because it was toxic. The government decided to remove it on the market, and you no longer find alternative of treating the object if the object is somehow damaged or is somehow affected. And because we don't have to sit there waiting for another guidance or another guide de laborantin, or maybe coming from I don't know, European countries that have the same object. So you find yourself obliged to look for solutions. And one of the solutions, you have to look after your elder, mommy or grandmother. How do used to treat this kind of object, you see? And day by day, you have to learn and unlearn what you already know, because if what you already know affects the object today and maybe in future, you have, to look for other solutions. And we started at the museum, we started with like inviting the elders who could share with us the knowledge of treating the objects. And we have outreach programs. We take some of their objects to them, but also we have to invite them to share with us the knowledge. I don't know if I responded to your question, but up to now, we are in the middle of conducting a study to see which method is efficient to our object, because at some point, even though I strengthening on the fact that the traditional methods of conserving or curating the objects were efficient and environmental friendly, and we don't have that knowledge yet. So we are in the middle of conducting the study to know which method is efficient, and at some point there are some that you can't do, or at a moment, I may admit that at some point we are still using chemicals on some objects, but that's not what we really want to do in the future. We want to correct that, but to be able not to repeat the same mistake, to balance the knowledge. So we'll have to make like a deep study on that.
Flavia, you were speaking about methodological approaches and how to think about toxicity from a standpoint of relationality and from a conception of toxicity as deploying an agency itself, as changing our relationship to the objects and as changing the practices that are actually possible or impossible in the collections. Maybe you can come back a little bit to this theoretical and methodological framework that you're based on, and maybe also your video practice.
Yes, it goes in a way back to a project, a predecessor project we did as interdisciplinary team called Times of Waste, and we were looking also at the notion of waste and the notion of waste as leftover. So that's what I did now as well with the toxic topic, and there the idea is in a way looking at the materiality as active matter, as it's for instance described by Jane Bennett in the book Vibrant Matter, and this also relates in a way to a broader framework of let's say Donna Haraway with the multi-species approach, or the actor network approaches by Bruno Latour and so, and new materiality is in a way building up on this kind of looking at actors, at materiality and people in interaction with materiality, and also let's say animals infecting perhaps as well, this kind of materiality, but also perhaps giving another notion to this kind of waste or toxin, and coming into another relationship. That's also something that would be probably what I would find quite interesting, that we try to look at leftover and toxin as in a way part of the object, and also part of the tracings we are trying to follow. In our case, we just were looking at object biography. We called it object biography, but in a way it's just an extended multi-local and multi-vocal kind of tracing we were doing on e-waste. And here I think that could be like a linkage to how to take the different actors into the situation where these processes are going on. And perhaps something I find quite interesting also regarding the German language. I mean, when we go with the term of waste, and we are confronted the whole time as well with disposal and Sorgen. And I would say we should come into another relationship to Sorgen. So that's the caring, but also critical kind of caring, and what this could be. I think that would be quite interesting to discuss, because I have the impression that this kind of caring notion comes from different persons also discussing in the morning. So that could be also like a point. Quite interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the extension of the notion of the object biography that you're proposing actually leads to a situation where the conservation process would start to be part of this biography, and so to be taken into account at the moment, for example, of a restitution that so far is absolutely not integrating the toxic legacies of European conservation history. Maybe we can at that point bring in the question of who has the agency for change. So, d'où viennent les impulsions du changement, qui sont les actrices et les acteurs qui en fait portent ces demandes de transformer les pratiques de la conservation dans les contextes différents. Ariane, tu veux commencer?
Oui, peut-être. Alors, c'est une question assez compliquée. Concernant les instruments de musique, je pense que de manière générale, quelle que soit leur provenance, on fait face à une certaine frustration lorsqu'on met un instrument en vitrine au sein d'un musée, et on le voit très bien avec les réactions des visiteurs. Et si on veut s'ouvrir à plus de pratiques vivantes, je pense que c'est vraiment, on connaît les limites de la définition et du rôle du conservateur-restaurateur. On sait qu'il y a l'idée qu'il faut préserver matériellement le bien culturel pour pouvoir le transmettre. Et donc, c'est dans la définition vraiment du rôle du conservateur-restaurateur qu'il doit prévenir si l'usage de l'objet risque de ne pas permettre sa préservation et donc sa transmission. Donc évidemment, pour les instruments de musique, cette limite est très présente. C'est des questions qui sont débattues depuis de très nombreuses années, et je pense qui ont été vraiment prises en charge pour les instruments français, par exemple dans les musées parisiens, parce que c'était les instruments et de la culture des gens qui travaillaient dans ces musées, et que par exemple les restaurateurs qui interviennent sur les collections d'instruments français sont des facteurs d'instruments qui connaissent ces instruments, et donc cette limite-là, elle se déplace un peu parce qu'il y a l'intérêt de jouer sur les instruments anciens, et que parfois on va faire une exception pour certains instruments, donc on considère qu'historiquement ils sont importants et intéressants et qu'il faudrait pouvoir les jouer. Je pense que pour les collections non européennes conservées dans les musées parisiens, la question s'est beaucoup moins posée parce qu'effectivement il n'y avait pas d'acteurs présents pour jouer de ces collections ou pour les valoriser différemment. Alors, c'est des questions qu'on essaye d'aborder aujourd'hui. Je pense notamment, par exemple, à la résidence sonore de Yumna Saba au Quai Branly actuellement, alors qui enregistre les vibrations des instruments de musique qui sont conservés dans les réserves, et d'une certaine manière, qui leur redonne la parole, qui leur redonne une voix. Je pense que, il y a des projets ponctuels comme ça qui sont mis en place autour de ces collections, mais qu'il faudrait pouvoir aller beaucoup plus loin, et je pense monter, ça passe uniquement par le fait de monter des groupes de travail interdisciplinaires et internationaux autour de ces collections, parce que c'est le premier défi dont je vous parlais tout à l'heure, c'est qu'on a vraiment un manque de connaissances et de documentation sur ces collections, et il faut vraiment pouvoir aller plus loin.
Chantal, you mentioned that the first persons to whom you would turn when you will look for you would look for alternative conservation practices would be your grandmother and your auntie. I'm just imagining what would happen if you would point yourself in front of a French museum and saying, like, give me access, this is my grandmother, she knows, what would actually happen. So how do we think about this, the possibility and the frame, the legal frame, and the frame of recognizing a multiplicity of knowledges and practices that may have been interrupted or covered up through the modern history of modern science and colonialism. So how to engage with this history, and what are actually pressure groups or people with whom you would get into exchange?
The group I would like to exchange, as you see, the group that possess those skills, those knowledge also. And you mentioned the legal framework, and sometimes the procedures we are working in prevent things to happen. So, for example, if I may want to treat objects in a traditional way, how are you going to pay those people who are going to, because the procurement steps you have to follow, they don't have companies. My grandma don't have company. And sometimes the procedures that we are using prevent things to happen. But if we really want to make changes, if we really want to correct the mistake that happened in the past, we all, wherever you are, whatever position you possess, we have to be like the leaders of the change from the top, from the boss, director general, to the administration, director of finance, the curator, whoever works in the museum might be the actor of the change. If we really need things to change, we all have the responsibility of breaking the walls, changing the things, and put the community at the heart of what we are doing day by day.
Flavia, you have been in the position of the artist who comes to the museum, or as an artistic researcher who comes to the museum. And we know that many ethnographic museums today invite artists to work in their collections and very often externalize the critical work that the museum should do to the artist. We saw a very interesting example this morning presented by Rosanna. And I wanted to know how you would describe what this role, or what could you carry in this process in the museum when coming from such a position. So what were the impulses that you felt you could leave in the museum through this intervention?
It's perhaps also a special situation because this foundation where I conducted research, they have a very kind of potpourri in the collection, and so they, at the moment, they were just concerned in trying to get, in a way, a picture on the collection itself and what was at stake with the collection regarding toxicity. And so, I mean, I don't know exactly if I could bring in something, but because I did an essay afterwards for a book that will be published on museale Reste, is the museum leftovers, is the title. But I think perhaps in the discussion, especially with one of the restaurators and curators who was also part of the process, it was for him perhaps like a mirror in a way, reflecting in a way the situation he was in during these cleaning processes. And a second point, perhaps, when I was writing in the article, that I had the impression that this kind of focusing on toxic leftovers as epistemic category somehow, because you just can read quite a lot out of it when you are looking closer, is not so much elaborated and made transparent towards the public. So that was a point that I really came across. And I don't know exactly if my text also was in a way just let the foundation hurrying up to put their kind of review on the process they did online, just for public use, just that public could follow what they did. It's not so clear for me, because it was more or less the same time when I just gave them the article to read back. But perhaps this is, in a way, the position we have as in a way, external persons going there, and also working with other media and trying to find other kind of presentation formats. And this could perhaps also be one point regarding documentation, which also mentioned in the morning. What kind of documentation is needed and what kind of representation is mirrored in this kind of media document that is produced? Is it really representing? Let's say in the case of Rosanne, would have been interesting if she thinks her aims are represented in the video, for instance, or in this combination of photography, text and sound she did, or if this should also in a way contain more the situation of having a closeness to the materiality, closeness to persons, and how is this in a way made visible or made approachable. Don't know if I answered.
Ariane, tu as déjà parlé, désolée là-haut de switcher tout le temps, d'intervention de cette résidence artistique au Quai Branly. Peut-être tu as un autre exemple pour une collaboration avec un ou une artiste qui justement pose des questions de conservation et amène à repenser les pratiques dans les collections que tu regardes.
Alors effectivement, ce n'est pas directement sur les collections que moi j'ai étudiées, mais il y a, je pense, une des restaurations qui est historiquement importante qui concerne le gamelan qui a été conservé au Musée de l'Homme. Et c'est une restauration qui a été effectuée en 1987 et pour laquelle, en fait, on a fait venir, alors je m'en veux parce que je ne connais pas son nom, mais un musicien javanais qui a accordé le gamelan pour qu'il puisse être joué au sein du salon de musique du Musée de l'Homme. Et donc, pour moi, sur les instruments de musique conservés à Paris, c'est vraiment un des premiers exemples de restauration pour lequel on fait intervenir une personne d'une communauté qui est liée à cet instrument. Et donc, c'est très intéressant, ça a été très documenté, et ça a été documenté dans une approche qui est vraiment une approche ethnomusicologique, et qui n'est pas une approche de conservation. Et donc, pour accorder cet instrument, il a fallu retirer de la matière. Et donc, c'est évidemment une intervention qui, du coup, a fait débat entre ethnomusicologues et conservateurs ou conservateurs-restaurateurs. Et ça montre bien que de s'ouvrir à d'autres pratiques et de créer des groupes de travail et des groupes de travail interdisciplinaires et internationaux nécessite d'accepter de déplacer son regard, de questionner les normes que nous, on applique et voilà, accepter de s'ouvrir un peu. Et cet exemple, historiquement, est vraiment assez révélateur.
Avant d'ouvrir à la discussion avec la salle, j'aimerais bien finir un tout petit peu en forçant les traits sur ce duo conceptuel entre la conservation et la transmission. On a discuté pas mal déjà ce matin, hier soir, sur la question de la primauté de la conservation, de la stabilisation matérielle de l'objet dans le cadre des musées occidentaux, de la mission même de la conservation qui va dans ce sens, et du possible conflit que ça peut susciter avec un usage, une transmission, une activation culturelle qui fait que l'objet peut être porteur de sens dans une communauté concernée ou pour des personnes spécifiques. Alors peut-être dans le cadre de pratiques où ça peuvent être des objets qui avaient vocation à disparaître au cours de leur usage et qui se retrouvent muséalisés. Et alors du coup, pour accomplir un cycle de vie, devraient en fait quitter ce régime patrimonial et réintégrer une certaine écologie qui peut comprendre une idée de décomposition, une idée de remplacement, de refacturation, mais en tout cas quelque chose où cette intégrité matérielle de l'objet n'a pas cette primauté que le musée occidental lui accorde. Et j'aimerais bien vous entendre sur ce souci ou sur cette nécessité, sur cette urgence de la question de la transmission, et la façon comment elle peut être conflictuelle ou pas. Alors dans la discussion d'hier, Chantal défendait plutôt que peut-être pas, peut-être ça peut aussi aller de pair, avec l'idée de la conservation matérielle de l'objet.
As I mentioned, the objects belonged, okay, I'm based at Ethnographic Museum, and the objects belonged to the people. Actually, it's all about people, because what we do have in our museums belongs to the people, and we are preserving those objects for the people. So for me, I think that the idea of transmission is very good, because in a way you preserve the actual object, but also we preserve the idea or ideas behind the objects. I may give some examples, because if I may say we keep objects behind glasses or behind showcases, not everyone is interested in coming in a museum, because when we first exhibited or when we first showcased the objects, it was not for, like, if I may say, for our community. So they somehow lost interest of coming to the museum, because it meant for tourists, it meant for others. But when you give, like, when you're trying to give, like, the life to the object, like the way Rosanna showed us this morning, taking some of the objects to the people, they will understand the value of that object, and they will even help us, you know, to keep that object for a longer period. Maybe I can give some examples that we did recently. We celebrated National Harvest Day. There was an object called igitenga. It's a sort of basket, a very big basket that was used to carry harvest around. And even for me, I didn't know that proper term was igitenga in my language. And when they asked for the igitenga, I couldn't find that object, and it was in the stores. But there was one old lady who came and said, "This is igitenga." So we took that object, and it was part of the celebration of the National Harvest Day. And because we didn't know that it was serving a particular purpose, we ordered, because there are still people who can make those igitengas, and people realized the importance of igitenga, people realized the importance of keeping that practice, and the local artisans are now making those like disappearing objects. That's one example of using the objects in non-exhibition ways, or giving the context, another context, which is the one we are used to. And for me, I think another good way of preserving museum collections is, you know, allowing our community to use them in a beneficial way. For example, you see I'm wearing a coat. I don't know if these patterns are familiar for you, but these are the patterns that were used on panel partitions, on basketry, everywhere. But because the artist was inspired by the pattern, he can't make the basket, but he's like a contemporary fashion, and he doesn't want the patterns to disappear, and he decided to put it on clothes. This is something which is sustainable. Maybe in 20 years or in 30 years to come, people will be wearing the, if I may say, or will have what we have in a museum, but in another way. So that's another good way of interesting people who lost their interest, because it also happened, who lost the interest in cultural material, to like be inspired by it and using it in the future.
I think Noémie this morning spoke about conservation as translation, and so in a certain manner, I think this is a very good example of how to translate a practice into another realm and into another gesture in order to revivify it now and to make it live again. Ariane, do you want to pick up on the idea of transmission?
Oui. Alors, si je reviens un peu sur l'exemple des instruments de musique dont je vous parlais tout à l'heure, c'est vrai que la question, c'est aussi qu'est-ce qu'on transmet à travers la matérialité de ces instruments. Et donc, si on reprend l'histoire des instruments du musée instrumental du conservatoire, il y a l'idée de leur dégradation, l'état dans lequel on les trouve à la fin des années 90 témoigne de la manière dont on les a traités au musée. Leur état matériel témoigne de leur histoire, témoigne de la manière dont on a conservé les collections issues des colonies, témoigne du regard qu'on a porté sur ces collections, peut-être du mépris qu'on a eu envers ces collections. Et donc aujourd'hui, la question qu'on se pose, c'est que si on restaure ces instruments, on efface ces traces-là, ce témoignage matériel. Et en même temps, et là il y a un vrai conflit, il y a un vrai nœud, si on ne les restaure pas, on les fige dans cette histoire, qui est une histoire muséale, qui est une histoire parisienne, et on les limite à cette histoire, ce qui est aussi très réducteur. Et donc il y a là une vraie question pour nous de comment on restaure ces collections et comment la manière dont on va les restaurer va directement impacter ce qu'on transmet et sur le long terme.
And just to close the panel, Flavia, like transmission is certainly a difficult question when you look at it from the vantage point of waste, and I like entsorgen. It's the first time for me to think about this German term, but maybe you can take it from there too, and think about how to reconnect the question or the history of these collections in relation to the toxicity that they themselves produced, but also that they are part of in the way how they were constituted in the very moment of collecting.
Yeah, perhaps coming back to this question of how to trace, in a way, the histories or the temporalities of the objects and what is also part of the object. So there, I could imagine to have a broader view. And perhaps one point as well, I found quite interesting, that the situation, if you want to put together these different aspects coming into account, then I think also performative formats would be quite interesting. So, I mean, I just hear people talking about going out of museum, out of the spaces, or discover other kind of spaces. So I think performative situations in other spaces could be perhaps also worth considering. And there, the media topic as well comes into play. How, in a way, would you then try to record or try to represent this kind of performative situation? I mean, we had the example in the morning by Rosanna, and I found this, in a way, also a promising way to found like other kind of activities in connection to objectivity and also to the toxins. I mean, that's the other question, how to come into relation to toxins. That's a little bit more difficult, but probably worth thinking about as well.
On this, I would open up to the audience and your questions and comments. Oh, we left you in the dark and discussed on the other side. Is there a microphone circulating somewhere? Otherwise, I can share mine.
Is there a question coming here? Or if not, maybe I have one. It's maybe a question for Chantal. It's very concrete. It's about collaboration and réseautage, and also Fatima mentioned that. And on the one hand, you talked about le guide du laborantin, which is really how a certain group of people impose the perspective. And on the other hand, when I first encountered your work, it was at a workshop called Decolonizing Conservation in the US. And I don't want to trace a linear link, but I wonder, are international collaboration helping? Or are they also a way to repeat a form of, I would not perhaps say violence, but disbalance? Do you know what I mean? Well, and maybe, yeah.
Of course, we don't want to repeat the same mistake, and we really want to balance, because I didn't stress it, but our community, their knowledge was somehow silenced. And it's now the time to, like, giving them the value. It's the time to balance the knowledge we have, guide du laborantin, et aussi the knowledge that the community has, not to repeat the colonial gaze or to continue spreading the colonial gaze. And for us, because the museum is for Rwandans, and of course international collaboration will be perfect, but if we want a museum for our community, we have to involve the community so that they become engaged actively and creatively, because we didn't exploit their knowledge before, and we really, because we are serving them, we want them to be involved more actively and creatively. I don't know if I answered your
totally, and I would perhaps just have a follow-up and say, but do people want that in Rwanda?
Yes, because we started that project in 2020, and we've had several sessions with the Rwandan community, and they all say it's the perfect time for us to make the museum that we really want. So the community is ready for that, and we are also ensuring that the community is welcomed, and so that we can have like a smooth collaboration. Yes.
I like that you mentioned the silencing part, because we were talking about knowledge that is lost, as if it just like felt out of the pocket, kind of. But it's like a bit like the unknown artist. That's Rosanna. It's so much. Even if in our phrasing, sometimes I think we tend to not say actually how the loss happens and why it does. does anyone want to have another word or just like share another thought? Look to, oui, Jean.
Merci, thank you. I don't want to take up too much time or space. I have the privilege of speaking anyways in a few minutes, but I just wanted to make the comment that it occurs to me as an Indigenous person from Canada who often works on Indigenous artifacts within a non-Indigenous institution, the role that conservators can play in helping to translate and transmit often has to do with the incorporation of Indigenous language terminologies into your own treatment records and treatment documentations, to the extent that the artifact in question has been removed from the Indigenous community in the first instance. That usually also necessarily means that it has lost its linguistic heritage as well. And we talk about the intangible values that are embedded in artifacts. From my perspective, it is precisely language that is the intangible value. So conservators can play their small part in helping to retain and revitalize the language by incorporating the appropriate Indigenous language terminology for the object in question within their own documentation as they go along. I realize that can be very difficult, but it bears looking into anyways. So I just wanted to suggest that. Thank you. Yahweh.
Thank you. I think I'm the one that mentioned it, giving some examples, and it's a long process, and it's a 10-year project, and we also planning to reworking on the documents that we do have, like inventory, like catalogs, including local terminologies, because we might have one name, but in another place they could have several names for the same object. So we are working with the community and from different regions so that they all feel represented. Yes.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I would suggest that we stop here and hand over to Leonie Hinault and John Moses, who we just heard speaking for the keynote of today. Before, just to give you a short outlook for the second session that we are still looking for, we wanted to finish the day by a discussion, so coming together with all of you into groups, probably in English and in French, in order to discuss a couple of the concepts and questions and problems and urgencies that we all are like, that all of you coming here have and bring also to the space, and conclude on what this collective discussion can bring about. On this, I hand over to you or directly to Leonie.
Don't we have a little break?
Oh, we have a break. Okay, sorry, I jumped the break.
No worries.
10 minutes of break. See you here in...
at 45.
Super, merci. Thank you so much for to the three of you. It's brilliant.